If you want to bake a sourdough bread, you first need a sourdough starter. And how you can make a sourdough starter is very easy, and I will show it to you. It will take a couple of days though, it's a lot of waiting involved. However, once you have your sourdough, you can use it over and over, but you need to take care of it. And I will also explain and show you how to do that. And I will show you how you can preserve your sourdough if you do not bake any bread for a longer period of time, and maybe because you're traveling or other reasons. And yeah, I will try to explain you everything I know about sourdough. There's a lot to know about it, but it's not complicated, so stay tuned and learn as much as you can in this video. Yeah, so in order to make a sourdough starter, you need 2 ingredients, and that's all. In this case, I have as one ingredient some rye flour, because I want to use this particular sourdough for rye bread. You can use any kind of flour to make a sourdough starter, and it's not law that you can only use like wheat starter for wheat bread or rye starter only for rye, though rye would be a little bit too awkward in like a toast bread. However, so you decide if you want to make just one kind of sourdough starter that you use on all your sourdoughs, or if you want to have different sourdough starters for different kinds of flour that you're using in the bread, okay? So the second ingredient is lukewarm water, and you mix these 2 ingredients for the same amount. So like in this case, I want to use 60 grams of the rye flour, and as I said, it could as well be some normal wheat flour or whole wheat flour or spelt flour, whatever flour you want to use. Okay, so this is 60 grams, and now I'm adding 60 milliliter of water, and because 60 milliliter is as much as 60 grams, I can just tar my scale and add as much water as I need to get to the 60 grams. Don't you like the metric system? I do. It's a little bit too much, but I can still also add a little bit of that rye flour just to even it out. Okay, so now I mix this. And the way this works is, you know, in the air and on the flour, everywhere we have bacteria and we have some wild yeast everywhere. And by giving some water to the flour, the acid lactic, I think that's acid lactic, Milchsäurebakterien in German. I think acid lactic bacteria, it's in English. They thrive when they are wet, and they need some food, which is in this case the flour. And we want these to flourish in this mixture so that they create some carbon dioxide and some acid. So basically what you can do now is that you cover it a little bit loosely, I would say, so should still some air come on into this bowl. And I'm using my wax fabric for that. I do not use cling wrap anymore for obvious reasons. Very few times I'm using cling wrap, only if I can't avoid it. So now this should stay on a warm place in your house, and if your house has no warm place because maybe it's winter or because you like it cold in your house, there's a little trick that I want to show you. So you probably know all these lunch bags, or sometimes you have larger versions of that as shopping bags where you can keep food cool. And you can of course also do the opposite and keep it warm in there. So what I'm doing is I have a bottle of warm water in here, and I put this into this bag, and I put this also into the bag, and close this a little bit so it stays warm in there. And now I have to wait 24 hours before I can continue with my sourdough. But I want to tell you one more thing. So the reason why I want this to be a little warm, it would also work in a colder environment, but if the sourdough is created in a cooler temperature, it creates more acid, and that makes your bread have more acid, and it's a stronger, maybe not so pleasant taste. So in order to have a rather mild sourdough starter, it's a good idea to keep it at a warm temperature while you're creating it and later when you're doing the sourdough itself. Yeah, so I hope it wasn't too difficult. The next step will be tomorrow and the day after that, and then I will explain you how you proceed with the sourdough once it's ready. This is day 2 of our sourdough, and yeah, our sourdough starter has rested for 24 hours now, and as you can see, not much has changed. It's still a gooey kind of thing, and it smells, let's say, slightly sour, but not much different than before. So what I'm doing today is I will add again lukewarm water and flour. So depending on the flour that you used the first day, you're using the same flour again. And I'm adding 60 milliliters of lukewarm water now. It was a little bit too much, that's okay. It can be a little more or less. I actually, in general, prefer to use a little more water when I do a rye flour recipe, and that also applies to the rye flour sourdough starter, because the rye flour soaks in more water than other flours. So I like this to be a little more wet. Try to mix the water in evenly before I add the flour. Okay, like this. And I tar it again to 0. And now I'm adding about 60 grams of the flour. This is already 30 grams. Getting there. Okay. And I stir this. Okay. And just like the first day, I will now cover this and put it aside for another day, at least 18 hours. That can already be enough. It depends a little bit on the temperature in your house. And as I explained in the video from yesterday, that it has to have a certain temperature so that your sourdough is not turning out too sour. Alright, so see you tomorrow. On the third day of our sourdough starter, you can see, or at least smell, that this has changed already. It smells a little bit sour, and sometimes you can see some bubbles in there. Let me see. Here you can see it's a little bit sort of foamy. There are air bubbles in here, which show me that this is definitely alive and working very well. And today I'm doubling the amount of water and of flour that I've already put in there, or roughly double it. And for that I will again add water. I will add 100 milliliter of water. And this is lukewarm water. And I think I haven't mentioned it before. If you live in an area where the water is chlorinated, then you should definitely use some filtered water, because the chlorinated water would not really be helpful with the growth of bacteria that we want in this case, because there are some good bacteria in this world too. So let me add the flour, 100 gram. Mix this in. And this is the last day of mixing our sourdough starter, because tomorrow we will have our basic sourdough starter finished, and you can already use it for a bread and make some sourdough, and from that sourdough then you can make one day later a real sourdough bread. Okay, so same procedure as before. I set this aside at a nice warm space in this house, and I again wait until tomorrow, and then I show you how it looks tomorrow. We've reached day 4 of our sourdough starter, and we do not need to add anything anymore, but I want to show you what happened here. So you can see that this is quite alive. This is like very foamy, and it's a little bit overripe. I should have taken it from the kitchen countertop earlier, because it's already sinking back in a little bit, but I'm not too worried about this. So you can see this is very foamy, very much alive. There's quite some activity going on here. It smells like beer, I would say. It's not unpleasant, it's a little bit sour, but it's not bad. So this is the finished sourdough starter, and usually you can decide now if you want to keep it for your next baking project or just use it right away. What you would do if you wanted to use it right away would be that you would take a part of the sourdough starter and mix it with flour and water in a larger amount than we did it before when we made the starter. Put this aside for a day and then bake with that sourdough the final bread. If you want to keep it in the fridge for your next baking project because you're not planning on baking a bread right now, then you would just put it into a jar and put it in the fridge. And in the fridge, this fermentation process will be slowed down, and so you can leave it in the fridge for about 7 to 10 days without paying any attention to it. But you should regularly feed your sourdough, and I want to show you how I'm doing that. So let me put this aside again. I have a sourdough here that is a little older. It's from, I don't know, 2 years ago. And some people just go ahead and stir it every now and then and say that's enough, that's all you need to do, and it can be enough. So you have probably noticed that there was some water on top of it, separated from the rest, and I just stir it in. And so this is what it looks like, but it's not very active, as you can see. So what I'm doing to feed it, and I really recommend doing this every 7 to 10 days, I'm using some lukewarm water, about roughly 100 gram. Okay, and then I'm adding 20 grams of my sourdough starter. And I mix this. And now I'm adding 100 gram of flour. This is a wheat sourdough starter, so that's why I'm using some wheat flour. So I'm basically doing the same thing that I did when I was making the starter. I'm just refreshing it. So my sourdough is more or less the mother cell of all my sourdoughs and sourdough breads. and I just keep feeding it. Okay, and this stays on my countertop now for 24 hours, and then I will put it in a jar and put it back into the fridge. So what to do with the remaining sourdough starter? If I would be baking a bread right now, I could just add it. It wouldn't do much because I didn't make a sourdough from it. I would just put it into the recipe. I could bake a bread with that right now. That's a different kind of thing. I will show you in my bread recipe how I use my sourdough and refresh it with baking. So if you're regularly baking with your sourdough, you don't need to do the feeding every week. If you're baking a bread or two or even more every week, then you'll be just fine and do what I'm doing in my bread recipes. But if you're not baking for a while, then you have to feed it like this, okay? So yeah, if you can't use this for anything, you just discard it, as sad as it is. But or you give it to someone you know, someone who wants to bake sourdough bread. A lot of sourdoughs are passed on between friends, and I think that's a wonderful thing. So now the next thing I want to show is what if I forgot to feed my sourdough for a while. So I abandoned this one for a while, and I'm not sure if you can see it. Let me put it up here a little bit. So this is some liquid up here, and it's really dark and looks ugly, very grayish. And you will probably in that situation wonder, is it gone bad? Do I have to discharge? Is it gone? Unless there is a really bad smell, or you see some mold on or in your sourdough starter, unless that's the case, it's still okay. So you probably heard a little bit of a sh when I opened this, and yeah, it smells sour. It doesn't smell that pleasant, but it's not really bad. So let me just stir this, and that's happening when you don't feed it for a while, but it's not dead. I could still refresh it and do the same thing that I just did and fed it. It might need a little more of a feeding, so I would probably feed it like 2 days in a row, and then it should be active and fermenting again. Okay. All right. So this is the case if you forgot your sourdough for a while. But what if you're not planning to bake for a longer period of time? Maybe because you're going on a vacation, or you're so busy, it's Christmas time, you're baking cookies instead of bread. Then you have a different option. You can kind of dry out your sourdough and put it into the fridge for a couple of weeks and then refresh it. And I'll show you now how I do that. First of all, I need quite a bit of flour, maybe like this, and I'm adding some of my sourdough to it, like 2 tablespoons, and then I'm using a bench scraper and mix this with the flour, and I want this to become not like a dough. I want this to become a really dry and crumbly consistency. So I'm mixing this. So it looks as if it was just some flour and nothing else, but still the lactic acid bacteria are in there, and so I basically want them to go dormant until I am using this again. Okay, and then I spread this out thinly. And I let this dry now, and once it's dry I will put it into a bag or into a jar, and then it goes into the fridge until I want to reactivate it. And for reactivating I'm just adding water to it, let it stand on the kitchen countertop for a day, then I might feed it one more time, and when I see it's really active, it's bubbling again, and it has all the activity that I want in it, and I can see the fermentation, then it's back to life and I can continue to use it and maybe make some more of it for the next baking. One more tip I want to give you is when you want to bake a bread with your sourdough starter, most recipes tell you just to take some part of your sourdough starter and mix it with the flour, etc., etc. What I learned is that if you take your sourdough starter out of the fridge like 2 days before you want to make your sourdough and feed it for 2 days, then it is probably a lot more active and has better results. So that's something to keep in mind. If you can plan ahead that far with your bread baking, then I would recommend take it out, feed it 2 days, have it stand on room temperature and become really active, and then add it to your sourdough or to the sourdough that you're about to make, and then bake your bread with that. It really turns out very good. So this is what I wanted you to know, mostly about sourdough starter and sourdough. There's more to it, and I wrote an article about the sourdough starter and how to treat it, how to keep it alive, and what to do with it. So if you go to this article on my blog, you will read more and have more information about sourdough starter, and I hope it's helpful for you. I know it's a very confusing topic for many people. I did my best to explain it very simple and very basic so that you get the important information, and some of this is just experience. So that's what I've figured out for myself. I just, if the longer you do it, the more often you do it, the better these things work. Thanks for watching. I hope this will help you with your sourdough bread, and I hope I see you in my bread recipes.